Welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started, even though we've got some people still coming in, trying to bring themselves in from the beautiful warm weather we're having, I'm sure. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all here to the second in our series on Pillars of Professional Prosperity. Many thanks for this venture go to Associate Dean for Student Life, Erin Murdoch, who is the brainchild and arranger of all this. I'm Lori Meffley-Kipp, the Interim Dean of the Graduate School and Vice Provost for Graduate Education. And it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome our distinguished guests. As we were planning this series, and Erin and I were talking about it, we just wanted to pick the very best and most illustrious of our professors here at WashU, and ones who are known for their really effective mentoring. That's the subject for this evening. We're going to talk about the complexities of the one-on-one individualized mentoring relationship in a variety of contexts. So the purpose of Pillars of Professional Prosperity is not just to speak to those graduate students who might be considering going into an academic career, but to talk about mentoring as a skill that can be used in a variety of situations and contexts. So in this session, you'll be learning about the different styles of mentoring, setting and accomplishing goals, and mentoring best practices. You'll get an understanding of resources available to help you navigate the mentor relationship and glean insights into growing professionally. And you'll be able to ask questions after our two presenters have finished their presentations. First, I'll introduce both of them right at the start and then let them go to it. Our first presenter will be Deanna Bartsch, who is the Gregory B. Couch Professor of Psychiatry, Chair and Professor of Psychological and Brain Sciences, and a Professor of Radiology. Bartsch studies cognitive and language deficits in disorders such as schizophrenia and the neurobiological mechanisms that contribute to such deficits. Her research includes behavioral, pharmacological, and neuroimaging studies with normal and clinical populations. She uses functional MRI, structural MRI, and cognitive neuroscience methods to examine neural bases of disturbances in cognitive control and emotional processing in individuals with schizophrenia and those at risk for the development of schizophrenia, as well as in individuals with mood disorders. And if you think a humanist could say all of those big words again, you've got another thing coming. That's quite a mouthful. Further, her work includes a focus on the ways in which early adversity, for example, poverty, stress, and disparities in access to healthcare shape early brain development and subsequent risk for mental health challenges. Our second presenter will be Lerone A. Martin, who is the Director of American Culture Studies, Associate Professor of Religion and Politics, American Culture Studies, and African American Studies. Martin's teaching and research focus on religion and religious and political history, the African American experience, the FBI, national security, and Freedom of Information Act law. Martin is the author of the award-winning Preaching on Wax, the Phonograph and the Making of Modern African American Religion. And if any of you saw the recent documentary series on the Black Church, you will have seen Professor Martin make a guest appearance on that wonderful documentary. His book tracks the role of the phonograph in the shaping of African American religion, culture, and politics during the first half of the 20th century. In support of his research, Martin has received a number of nationally recognized fellowships, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship, and the Louisville Institute for the Study of American Religion fellowships. His commentary and writing have appeared in popular media outlets, such as the NBC Today Show, CNN, the New York Times, Religion Dispatches, Charisma, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. As you can tell from these introductions, both of these colleagues of mine are wonderful and beloved and rock stars in their own right. So I'm going to turn it over now to Deanna to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I'm going to share my screen. And please let me know if it doesn't work for some reason. I gave a talk earlier this week where I had no clue that my slides were flipped around and I kept going. So, um, all right. Well, thank you again for asking me to come and talk about this. And I think it's best to have truth in advertising, which is for faculty of my generation, it's not like, for the most part, we ever had any formal training in mentoring or what it means to be an effective mentor or anything like that. So I'm so glad that the graduate school is trying to organize ways to help you all get some of that training, because I think this needs to be much more systematically a part of the training that we do in academia in order to make sure that folks know about effective mentoring practices and are able to kind of propagate that on through the different generations. And I think, it's important to start out by thanking the people who have been mentors to me throughout my career and continue to be mentors. So I had mentors as an undergraduate without whom I don't think I would have ever gotten into academia. I had mentors in graduate school who were endlessly supportive. I had actually multiple mentors as a postdoc. I had mentors as a new faculty member. And I'll be honest, I continue to have people that mentor me and for whom I go to for advice. So you're really never too quote unquote old for mentoring. And so, even now that we're starting to talk about you being a mentor to other people, keep in mind that, really all of us can benefit from mentorship. And I'm also going to talk about sponsorship in a little bit throughout our entire careers. So I would never hesitate to reach out. So I kind of, when I sat down to think about this, I thought about what are some of the key principles I've learned about just both by my own sort of experience, but in other things that I've been involved in as a faculty member thinking about mentoring. So I think a first key principle is that mentoring is not at all one size fits all, right? I cannot give you a list of ways in which you should mentor that are going to be effective for all people in your life that you are going to be a mentor to. And I'm guessing that many of you respond differently to different kinds of mentoring practices and have different fits. So I think that's a really key thing to be very intentional and thoughtful about, is that it's just not going to be one size fits all. And that I think one of the things that effective mentors do is think about how to shape good practices for mentoring to the individual's needs. Every mentee has unique strengths and unique areas of growth. They have different personalities, they have different working styles, right? And while I think there are some very clear good practices that are universal in terms of like putting the needs of the mentee as an important thing, and trust and setting clear expectations, kind of the specific ways in which you engage with each mentee may be different depending on their particular strengths and like I said, areas for growth. So I think that's like a very key principle to think about from the beginning. And I think one of the challenges as a mentor is to figure out how to harmonize your mentoring style and approach with what the mentee needs. And this can take many different forms. Some of the things that I've experienced the most being different across mentees are people differ very much, for example, in how much they are able to self structure themselves versus needing you to help them with things like deadlines and organization. Some people would be really offended if I gave them a deadline for a draft of something, and other people really want that. You know, Even other things like, do they want to work on papers with you as outlines or full text? Do they want regular meetings or as they want, right? Um, Different people are going to need different things. And so I think it's important to if you're going to be an effective mentor to a lot of different kinds of people, to figure again how to harmonize your mentoring approach with what the mentee needs. Um, Another key principle I think is to mentor early and often. And I think there's a couple components to that. So, first off, I think you have to really learn not to assume that the mentee knows what they need, what to expect, or how to ask for it, right? I'm guessing many of you can resonate with that as well. Usually if you're in a position of being a mentor to someone, they are someone who's new to whatever area you're mentoring them in. And I think it's often easy to assume that they kind of know what they need and they'll ask you for it. And I just think you cannot assume that at all. Um, so I think starting very early on, it's important to try to have regular meetings and sort of really set the stage for clear communication and expectations for clear communication. And I think, that has to come ideally. I think good mentors are the ones who set that up and don't wait for the mentee to reach out and ask it. Um, if you set up expectations for things like regular check ins and evaluations of how things are going, I think it has some benefits of making it less of sort of like a big deal if you have some constructive criticism that you need to give. Because it's more of a regular thing that you're doing with mentees, and it doesn't become this like big thing where you have to set up a meeting and have a discussion about an issue. If you are regularly having meetings and you have an expectation that you're regularly checking in about how things are going, what's working, what's not working, how might we change things. And again, I think very intentionally trying to set up your communication style with them so that they have the opportunity to raise issues or concerns about their own progress or about your relationship. Um, I think the other thing that I have learned, and it was a lesson that took a little while to learn, was do not assume that your mentees will remember everything that you talked about in year one of your relationship when they are in year two or year three or year four. um, we by the time you get to be in the position of being a mentor, you've often had a lot of experience in whatever domain you're in. And I think it's easy to assume that I'll say something once and then I've imparted that information, and of course they'll remember that for the rest of their career. um, I think about your own experience in graduate school, right? Year one, people probably told you about everything you had to do all your years in graduate school. And I'm guessing there's probably zero chance that you remembered all of that and or had all of that in the forefront of your mind through every year in graduate school. So like one of the things that we now regularly do in our department is have yearly check-in meetings with all the graduate students where we go through all of the sort of expectations and things that have to be done in the to get their degree, on the assumption that you know in year one you're really paying attention to the things that you need to do most immediately, and you're not thinking as much about the things that you have to do later. And we shouldn't assume that you're just going to remember that, but to really kind of revisit those kinds of things over time. I just think getting that early on and knowing that's true also helps you from getting frustrated with a mentee if you feel like, oh, I said this, and or we talked about this, and why aren't they doing this, or why haven't they changed this. Remembering that it takes a while to learn those things, and you don't always remember them, and you kind of need that information sometimes on a more as needed basis. So that's the kind of often part of the mentoring early and often. um, I think another really key principle that again, it took me a long time to kind of learn this, is to really make expectations very clear and concrete from the beginning of your relationship with a mentee. I think that again, I alluded to this before, but I think this is often particularly true in academia, that we often assume that there are things that folks just know, or that they will absorb by osmosis from their surrounds. And that is where so many misunderstandings occur, because you think, oh well, did they just know that they were supposed to do X? Well, how are they supposed to know that you know they did X, even if you can't remember getting formally trained on certain things when you were a graduate student? That and maybe you somehow managed to pick up on some things from the air or the environment, doesn't mean that that's easy for everybody to do. And that it's really behooves us to try to really make expectations clear and concrete. I will say that this is particularly important when you are working with mentees who come from identities that are underrepresented in academia. I was a first generation college student. when I got to graduate school, nobody in my family had ever been to graduate school before. And so there were lots of things that my peers who came from families that had a lot of people who had advanced degrees kind of knew about how things worked that I didn't know, right? And if they had just assumed I would know all these things, my mentors, I would have missed out on a lot of opportunities. I would not have understood, for example, how to get letters of recommendation. I wouldn't have understand how things worked at conferences, right? So someone needed to tell me how those things worked because I didn't come up in academia or come up with a family who'd had advanced degrees. And so as we are really trying to diversify academia, I think it's very important to even the playing field by making expectations clear and concrete and making information available to everybody and not assuming that people will just know or that they will figure out a way to get that information if you don't tell them. So clear and concrete expectations early and often mentoring. Um, if you're comfortable doing so, I would also strongly encourage you to think about um, with your various mentees, sharing, if you have them, your own struggles and sort of story of progress through undergraduate, graduate school, when you are eventually faculty members or have positions in, companies or other things. And the reason I say that is that in my experience, mentees often have this misperception that we arose fully formed. Uh, I'll give you a concrete example of what I mean by that. Anybody who knows me now will know that I am not a particularly shy or retiring person about speaking up in public or raising my hand or asking questions at talks or, kind of, speaking up. And so they assume that I was always that way, and that if they are not that way, there is no way that they will ever become that way, right? And I often wish I had a videotape of myself in my early years in graduate school because I was so anxious about asking questions in public. The first time I asked a question at a talk, I literally was shaking so hard, and the person next to me kept having to elbow me because they knew I had a question to get me to raise my hand, right? um, if I didn't share that kind of information with my mentees, right, I think their perception is if they're not like me now, they can never be like me, right? Or that being like me is the only way to be successful, in whatever career I've chosen. And if you don't share some of your own struggles or path, they may not understand that there's a lot of growth that occurs over time as you get your graduate degree in whatever career you're going to pursue. um, and they will assume that if they don't already have those skills and abilities, they won't ever be able to develop them. So I think helping to kind of demystify some of that and to remind people that, as a mentor, maybe more senior, you're on the other end of a lot of growth, that already occurred and that you might have been very different and much more in their position early on. And I think that really helps people to be able to see that even if it's something they're struggling with now, it's something that they might be able to, make progress on and be more comfortable doing later on in their career. Okay. Here's another one that I both had an experience with as a graduate student and then even as a mentee. We spend a lot of time talking about how to give constructive criticism to people, right? Because a lot of what we're doing is, okay, you know, and this is true in academia in general, there's a lot of feedback, right? And it's often not always positive feedback. But I think it's absolutely critical to be intentional about giving both positive feedback as well as constructive criticism to your mentees across all stages. And I'll tell a little anecdote. I When I was in graduate school, I was my graduate advisor's first graduate student, so he had never had a graduate student before, and he's a wonderful person. He's the most upstanding person I've ever met. But every meeting we would have, he would give me constructive criticism, meaning negative feedback about whatever we've been doing, the writing, whatever. And it got to be kind of demoralizing after a while because I felt like I never getting any positive feedback. And I had a couple peers who were also his in one of his we were actually clinical science students, so we were in his tuition group, and they were having the same experience. So we staged an intervention and said, like, it would be really helpful if you gave us some positive feedback. And he was really stunned because he assumed, again, this issue of assuming that we got the positive part and that what he needed to point out was the negative part. And I thought, oh, I'll never do that myself. And after first couple of years of being a faculty member, a couple of my students said the exact same thing to me. Like, you're always giving us constructive criticism, but we don't feel like we're doing anything positively. So I would try to be very intentional about always coupling as much as possible constructive criticism with positive feedback to really help people both see where they're doing well, and putting them in a position to maybe be able to better hear and integrate and internalize in a constructive fashion the critiques that you need to give them in terms of areas for improvement. Um, Again, in theme of don't assume things, don't assume they're picking up your positive vibes implicitly, or that they're reading all the same nonverbal cues that you think you're giving them, but to try to be very explicit and intentional. Okay, I just want to keep an eye on the time. Okay. I'm going to move a little bit quicker. So one of the things, I'm happy to share these slides with people so we don't have to go through them in detail, but one of the things that we started doing in our department a couple of years ago, which I think is really, really helpful for this explicit expectations idea, is we've asked all faculty to develop a concrete mentorship expectation discussion guide, where there's a series of questions that we came up with about things that are often issues in a mentoring relationship. And then we ask each faculty member to kind of write out what their expectations are, and then to have an explicit discussion with each new graduate student or undergraduate student about these things. And some of them may seem kind of mundane, but being explicit about it actually helps to avoid things that end up creating conflict between mentors and mentees. So things as simple as, like, meetings, what should the expectations be, right? Like, if you don't discuss it concretely and the student is assuming, we have regular meetings, but the mentor is assuming the student will reach out when they want to meet, the student might get upset, thinking that the mentor is ignoring them, not realizing that the mentor has a different expectation. Systems of communication, lab roles and duties, what is the student's research? What is the mentor's research? How do you, connect those two? Conferences, writing papers, like, there's a whole bunch of these things that if you can sort of have more explicit discussion early on, I think you have an opportunity to work out any conflicts or issues when it's less hot and in the moment, and for people to have the sort of same set of expectations about things going forward. Um, Collaborations, work-life balance, that's a big one. Consultation, letters of recommendations, all these sorts of things. And this has been really invaluable once we started doing this, because I think it really helped to get people more on the same page early before misunderstandings and conflicts arose. Okay, I'm just going to really quickly end up on a point I want to make that I didn't learn about this till I was a faculty member and started doing, like, leadership courses. We're talking about mentorship. Mentorship is absolutely important, but it's also important to think about whether you are in a position to serve as a sponsor to someone, which is something slightly different than mentorship. So, mentorship is about sort of giving advice and support and guidance, sharing wisdom, being there as a sounding board, helping someone to think through, options and opportunities and those sorts of things. But being a sponsor is about being willing to spend some of your political or social capital to help them achieve their goals, right? So it's things like, you know, nominating people for awards and prizes, helping people to make connections with others in the field, recommending them for talks or memberships on committees. Um, and if you are currently in a position where you have a mentor but you don't have a sponsor, we should talk about how to help you find sponsors who will help you achieve your career goals. But when you are in a position to be a mentor, if you are in a position to also serve as a sponsor in some of these roles, great. Sometimes you can't. maybe you don't have those connections, or for whatever reason you can't. But then I would encourage you to think about being explicit in terms of helping your mentee find people who can help play those roles, right? And again, this is in this realm of a lot of things people just assume happen spontaneously. They don't, right? And so intentional, purposeful, sponsorship in addition to mentorship can actually be really valuable in promoting the careers of your mentees. So I will stop there because I don't want to take up too much time, and I will turn it over to Dr. Martin.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate your comments. A lot of what I have to say, I think, dovetail really nicely with what you've already stated. I think I have a metaphor that I like to use just because I'm a huge sports fan, as the dean of the grad school knows. So a lot of what I have to say, you'll hear repeated, but I'll be using the metaphor of sports. But let me start, as my colleague did, by pointing to the folks who are really important to me. So as Professor Barch said, that, coming from an underrepresented group, the first person I would call would be my mentor would be James Lewis. He was a professor I had in undergraduate. And he was the first African-American professor I had. And it was the first time I went into a class and thought maybe that I would like to do this. And it was because of him. So I've always been thankful to James Lewis. He mentored me, let me know what the process was like doing a PhD. He was a graduate of Duke. And so I just kind of got an understanding of what the whole layout was. When I got to seminary, I went to Princeton Seminary to do my Master's of Divinity degree, and had a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful mentors there. The one that sticks out for the most outstanding is a professor by the name of Noliwe Rooks, who was actually just a guest here at WashU. She gave a talk here. And what I learned most from Noliwe is obviously about the gendered notions of our profession. She really opened my eyes to that in a way that no one else had done before. But she also pointed out to me, maybe we can talk about this later, but she also pointed out to me the kind of ubiquitous nature for many folks of imposter syndrome. And she was the first person who ever named it for me. And she talked about how one deals with that. And I was like so thankful, because I was like, oh my God, everybody feels it. I'm not the only one who feels this way. So we can talk about that, but I'm so thankful to her. Then I got to graduate school. Earl Lewis, who's a historian, was so good to me and showing me the craft of my discipline. Gary Latterman as well. And then as a junior faculty member, I was fortunate enough to have such great colleagues, including Dean Nafli Kipp, who was so gracious to me. And one of the things that I learned from her upon arriving was what it means to be a good colleague, that once you get your degree and once you're in your profession, to give to others and not just to be focused on yourself and your own research. She was always willing to read something for me, always willing to write recommendations for me, give me advice. And so she just modeled for me what a good colleague was. So for all of these folks, I've tried to pay it forward in everything that they've done for me. So my sort of mentoring metaphor is being a good mentor is like being a good coach. So I'm a basketball fan. So I think about some of the great coaches in basketball. And I hope I'm not offending anyone's sports allegiances when I say this, but I think of folks like Phil Jackson, Pat Riley, Pat Summitt from UT Knoxville. And one of the things I think that all these good coaches do, I want to make that clear, good coaches do, is I think the first thing that good coaches recognize is their personnel. And that is like, who do you have on the team? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of the folks that are on the team? And I think, as my colleague said today, I think part of that is learning your mentees' strengths and weaknesses, try to have a conversation with them about that, but also not being afraid to share with them your own strengths and weaknesses. So you kind of know both, as Professor Barch said, that mentee knows that we didn't come fully formed, that we too were once grasshoppers, so to speak, and to figure out what strengths and weaknesses are there between yourself and your mentee to better understand one another and what you're dealing with. And I think that one of the things that I would second is that it's good to find out what your mentee's sort of style of work is like. So, as Professor Barch said, you may find some of your mentees are very self motivated, and you're not going to need to give them deadlines. You're not going to need to tell them, turn this in. In fact, you may have to do the opposite. You may have to tell them, slow down and smell the roses. But you'll have others who will need structure, that will need deadlines, they will need hard sort of parameters about when to turn things in and when to check things off. So it's good to just kind of have that conversations about strengths and weaknesses to know your personnel. And then I think the next step to that is being clear about what the goal is. I think sometimes as faculty members, we might assume we know exactly what our students want to do. Or, clearly you want to go and become a tenure track professor, but sometimes that may not be the goal. You may have folks who are more interested in teaching maybe at a teaching college as opposed to a research one. You may have folks who want to do the other kinds of work in the nonprofit field. So I think it's good to have a conversation about what is the goal. Obviously that goal could change, but I think it's good to have very concrete conversations about what are the next steps, what's the goal. And then once you've established your personnel, your goals, then you got to have a conversation about expectations. And I think any human being, whether you've studied psychology, you've studied family science, or you've just breathed air, you know that any relationship oftentimes breaks down when expectations are not met or are not stated, right? And I think that's the same thing with the mentoring relationship. You've got to be clear about what the expectations are. I hold myself to a certain kind of expectation, try to communicate with my students. This is what you should expect from me, and try to hold myself accountable to that. And then in exchange, try to have a conversation with my students about what I expect from them. So I expect certain kind of parameters around recommendation letters, as Professor Barsham talked about. Ideas around and to turn in work, email, professionalism, whatever these expectations are, they should be stated. So that way we're not having any type of situation where people are feeling their needs aren't being met, people are feeling disrespected or overlooked. If you have a conversation, as Professor Barch talked about, although it happened in the intervention, but if you just have a very upfront conversation that we need some constructive feedback, or we need this, or we need that, I think that can help stop a lot of hurt and pain and frustration. I think after that, I think it's important to be give constructive criticism. I think that's important. That's part of the mentoring relationship. It needs to be, but that's key, constructive criticism. I think the old school style of mentoring is to completely tear everything down. I have colleagues, so most of us do, who've gone through graduate school, and their advisors' kind of way was just to tear everything apart. You write something, you turn it in, and they tear it apart. That's not always very constructive. Criticism needs to be constructive, not just tearing down, but also trying to find a way to build up. You did this, maybe let's try to change it and go this way, or you did that, let's maybe try this, as opposed to just completely tearing everything down. And then I think a good coach also celebrates those victories. I think what the business we're involved in is a marathon. And I think that it's good to stop and celebrate every single type of accomplishment, whether it's finishing a semester, finishing a paper, finishing exams, finishing your first conference paper, whatever it may be. I think it's important as a mentor to celebrate with your mentees every time they check off a box or every time they cross a different stage. I think a good coach is always there, not only just to give constructive feedback, but also to celebrate. And finally, I think every now and then, I think a good coach has to be a good cheerleader. I think you've always got to encourage your students, your mentees, because you know, as I said, this is a marathon, and sometimes it can get very difficult. And we all need a good cheerleader every now and then to cheer us on and to remind us of our goals, to remind us why we do it. I think what we are involved in, there's so many moving parts. Sometimes the goal can get lost, or the love or the reason why we do what we do gets lost. And I think if you can always have someone there being a cheerleader for you and cheering you on and reminding you why you've decided to do and to be engaged in this profession, I think that's always good. So I think I've recapped a great deal of what my colleague has said and using this metaphor as a coach, but I'll go over it again. I think a good coach knows his or her personnel, the strengths and weaknesses. You're reminded of the goals, then you set clear expectations and you communicate those expectations, always being mindful that those expectations could change, relationships change, expectations could change. And then you provide constructive criticism and also celebrate, and at times it have to be a cheerleader. I think I think good mentoring involves all of those things, and I think if you can put those principles into practice, I think you'll find that your relationships will be a little more easier to manage and to be kind of clear about what's expected. This is the things I try to put in practice with my students. And I think that once we get through the part about knowing one another, strengths and weaknesses, we're able to negotiate this relationship much better because we know one another. I kind of know what to expect, they know what to expect, and then we can go from there. So I'll stop there with my comments, and I guess we'll look forward to questions. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. Yes, we have one question on deck ready to ask. As a mentee, how can we ask our mentor to be more flexible in their approach to support us in the best way? And on the flip side, what is the best way to create space in a conversation for feedback on flexibility and your role as a good mentor?
Well, you started with an easy one. Well, Lerone, do you want to say something? I don't know how we. It's harder when you're not in person to have cues.
I know. No, go ahead, and I'll follow up.
Okay. Yeah. So there's two things I'll say. One of which is going to be somewhat less helpful, but um, I do think in general, across academia, departments need to start having more conversations about this to make it easier for graduate students to have space to do this with their mentors, because it's really a big ask on you if there's like nobody in the departments at all talking about mentorship styles and flexibility, and then you suddenly have to come in and be like, by the way, right? So if there's already an open conversation in the department amongst the faculty about what does it mean to be a mentor, these kinds of things, it makes it much easier. That doesn't help you in the moment, right? But I'm just saying in general, when, wherever you're at, whether it's, industry or academia or whatever position, if you can help start those conversations to make space for the next kind of cadre of people, it, now for you, honestly, it's going to really depend on what your relationship is currently like with the mentor, right? And
Yeah.
whether there's someone with whom, you can say, like, can we have a conversation? But I will say, this is going to sound a little Machiavellian, but I'm going to say it anyway. Having come to a thing like this, like saying to a mentor, like, I just came from a workshop from the graduate school on mentorship, and they said we should have a conversation with our mentors, right? So now it's not you, it's you're listening to what we told you to do, right? And so that can make it, open it up and maybe make it less personal and less like I have a problem with you. It's more like, hey, they told us what we're supposed to do is have this conversation. Could we have this conversation? And maybe that would give you a little bit more comfortable space to do that.
No, I think that's a very, very, very wise advice. And I would only add to that, when you have the conversation and you've blamed it on us that we told you to do this, frame the conversation as it relates to goals. So frame the conversation in saying, so as I'm thinking about trying to reach whatever the goal may be, trying to get through my comprehensive exams, trying to write my dissertation chapter, trying to get something published, whatever it may be, say, I think what I need in order to accomplish this goal is X, Y, and Z from you. Is there a way that we could work this out where you'd be able to provide that to me? I think if you can frame it that way, that's the best way to frame it, to always frame it in terms of that you're trying to reach a stated goal in mind, so that it's not personal, it's not your horrible mentor or something to that effect. It's always with, this is the goal in mind and this is what I think I need to reach that goal. And I think if you can do that, I think that's the best way to frame that kind of conversation.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question is, how do you balance setting expectations and meeting students where they are at?
Well, I think with me, part of getting to know the students, I think then helps to shape my expectations. I think there's a combination of figuring out where the student is, but also setting expectations that will encourage the student to grow. So not expectations to something that's really easy for where they are. I mean, there are basic expectations, I think, certain ideas of professionalism, I think that we could discuss here if you like. But then also then figuring out a way that can set expectations that will encourage the student to grow, to reach a new level of where they might be. And that might be everything from maybe being a B student to an A student, a C student to a B student. It might be, again, publishing. It might be to be more outspoken at conferences, right? Whatever that may be, I think, you try to balance it and set it so that it's students have an expectation and the goal is obtainable. It's not good to have expectations that are so far that the student can't reach it, because then it only sets them up for failure. And that sometimes can be very traumatic and not very helpful.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I do think that there's a big distinction between like expectations about like how you interact and, meetings and those kinds of things. I mean, there are some students who struggle with that. And I think it's important to hopefully be able to talk to students about that and help them figure out how to manage those. Um, but I think that's very different than like their career goals, right? And part of it too is again needing to take a look at your own. Like I again sharing my own struggles. I struggled early on in my career because I kind of felt like every student had to be a mini me and be pursuing the exact same career path I was setting those expectations on them. And it took me a while to kind of learn to step back and be comfortable with the fact that there's lots of wonderful careers that people could go on. And that if I was going to be a good mentor, I needed to be able to have those conversations with students and readjust expectations and goals appropriately to their career path. So, I do. So basically what Dr. Martin said.
Awesome, thank you. Next question. How do you ask your mentor for positive, constructive feedback?
Well, as someone who had to do that, um, you know, I, it was hard. I did a lot of practicing with my peers before I went in and did it with him. And I framed it. So I'm going to take a page off of Professor Martin's book, which is framing it in terms of goals. Like I knew deep in my heart that he wanted me to be successful, right? I truly believed that. And I also believed in this case that he didn't realize that this interaction style was problematic for me. So I framed it in terms of like, look, I know you want me to be successful. My style is such that it's difficult for me to hear the constructive criticism when I perceive it as really negative, right? Like I will be able to hear it better and operate on it better if it can be framed this way, right? And again, at the risk of getting a reputation for being Machiavellian, right? Um, it- you know, framing it in terms of like you have really good your advice and wisdom is really helpful, but sometimes I get defensive and can't hear it, right? So if you frame it that way, again, it's reshaping it as tapping into what you hope is their goal for you, their positive, hopeful goal. and helping them to understand that you might need to hear that in somewhat different ways, and that you need to hear the sort of positive, helpful pieces as much as you need to hear what's not going well. Um, you're going to be in a tough position if it's an old school mentor who thinks that you got to break people down to build them up. And I have less good advice for how to deal with that, other than trying to find additional or other mentors to help buttress that, or to have a conversation with them about it.
Amen.
Okay, wonderful. Next question. How do you strike a balance between encouraging your mentee to expand and making sure that it's not too much for them?
I mean, I think that maybe we could, go back to this conversation about revisiting what the students' ultimate goals are. Maybe go back to saying, okay, let's go back and visit, what's the goal here? What's the sort of destination you want to arrive? Is it to get this paper published? Is it to get a certain grade in this class? Is it to whatever it may be? And go back to that, and then maybe work backwards and say, okay, well, if that's where you want to be, I think the next move we need to make is this or this or that. That might be the best way. Start with something that's where the student says he or she wants to go, where they want to go, and go from there. That's probably be my best advice.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think this is also where setting up expectations for regular check-ins help, because what you can say, right, is, okay, let's try this, right? And then we'll check in every X period of time and see how things are going, right? And, if it turns out that, doing these different things are stretching you too thin and you're not accomplishing the goals that you articulated, then we can reevaluate, right? So if you think of it as a process that we're kind of, constantly evaluating and checking in and doing it, it's sort of not an either or, and it gives you a good opportunity to do some course correction if it needs to be done.
Thank you. Next question. What would it take to make mentoring of students and mentoring of junior faculty something that gets reviewed and evaluated for promotion and tenure?
Wow. I study religion, so my initial response would be the return of Jesus, but but that's not helpful. Man, what do you think, Deanna?
I mean, I think it's starting. I think students piece is starting to happen, because at least in our department, we regularly talk about, when we evaluate junior faculty, are they able to attract and retain great graduate students and undergraduates, and how are those students doing? So that is very explicitly a part of our process now. I think, but it's also very different across different departments, because
Yes.
graduate student mentoring plays a very different role across disciplines. So in my
It does.
discipline, the sciences, like you won't get tenure if you're not decent about your students, because you need them to help you with your research. I think that's harder in like some of the humanities disciplines, where maybe you don't take on mentoring more significantly until you're, post tenure. But there is a move in academia to try to do more kind of ongoing feedback and mentoring of faculty post tenure. And so that's an opportunity for that to kind of come in as well. So it's slowly starting to change. But it's honestly, I think of it as like the having these conversations now, such that when you are in a position to be making decisions about what the promotion and tenure criteria is, like, we need to be passing it forward, and not just saying, well, this is what I had to deal with, everybody else should, but like really trying to make changes when you're in the position to have the power to do so.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that some institutions and departments are thinking about the junior faculty aspect, in the sense of not just what faculty are doing to attract students, but also what are departments doing to help junior faculty to be successful. And I think that institutions, including our own, are really giving that a look about what's important in department health and how what happens in departments and things of that nature. So I think that we are hoping that it's a slow moving ship and it turns very slowly. But I think hopefully with the new generation of faculty folks who really realize these things are important will help to really change the tide in important ways.
Great, thank you. Let's see. As a mentee, what are constructive ways to handle your mentor exhibiting favoritism, whether perceived or real, in a lab or research group?
I don't have a lab, so that's all you.
So that's a tough one.
It is.
It is a tough one because mentors are people too, and there are it's like being a parent, right? Like I mean, I don't mean to sound this in a paternalistic way, but I often think of mentoring as a lot like parenting, right? Like and the same way that you need to try to be selfless, to all those kinds of things. um I think the probably the best thing to do is, if possible, to have a conversation with the mentor. But if you were going to do so, I would definitely suggest framing it not in terms of um, the idea that your perception of the situation is absolutely correct and the mentor is being wrong, but more in a sort of like information seeking approach. Like, I'm having these feelings or I'm having these concerns. I don't know whether this is my perception or real, but especially if there's concrete things that this other person is getting that you would like to have, right? Opportunities for co-authorship, opportunities to present, projects they can get involved in. If you frame it in terms of goals, like, I would really love to have that opportunity too. What could I be doing differently, to position myself to be able to do that? And I recognize that that may not always feel good if you feel strongly that the mentor is engaging in favoritism or bias. But my guess is that going in hot and saying that is probably not going to help you accomplish your goals.
I would only say yes to that. I think in framing it again within goals and not saying, well, you do this for person A, I need you to do that for me too, and just frame it on what you need and say, I think I need a little more, I need a little more of this, a little more of that. I need a little more attention on this. I think that that's probably the best way. So I completely agree with that.
Great, thank you. Next question is, let's see, what are your practices for supporting students in writing single authored papers, including them on teams, research grants, navigating co-authorship and author order, corresponding author, and your own co-authorship on student papers?
Well, I'll start first, if that's okay, Deanna, because I'm sure that I probably have less to say about this. I just had my first experience as a co-author as a professional with one of our professors in our psychology psych department in brain science, Clara Wilkins, and that was new to me. The whole author order, and Clara was so good at walking me through everything. I was like, well, why is my name last? And she's like, no, that means you're the senior author. It's good. It's okay. Like, she was she was very helpful to me. So she walked me through that. So Clara Wilkins was mentored me. As far as working with students, I'll say really briefly about authoring papers. I've had students, and what I've tried to do is get them connected, at least on the undergraduate level, to the Office of Undergraduate Research, which is wonderful here, which gives students resources and money. So I guess you could say, to use Deanna's wonderful term, I tried to be a sponsor and write recommendations for them or connect them to the Office of Undergraduate Research to give them funding. And I think for many students, it's the first time they say, wow, like, I'm doing research that I enjoy and I'm getting compensated for it. I'm getting resources to go travel to do research. And I think that I've tried to do that, and students have taken some of their thesis work and other work and have tried to get it published, whether it's a local journal here at WashU or a state journal in Missouri, and so forth and so on. So I've always tried to be a sponsor, and I think that's the best thing, because as Deanna was saying, I learned that every student doesn't have to be like me. They don't have to be interested in the same things, but I can still be a sponsor and I can still help them formulate their research question. So even if I'm not interested in 20th century environmentalism, I can still help them formulate a question, a research question that can help both get grants, get money, and get resources. So I've tried to be the sponsor and the cheerleader in that regard.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think this comes up a lot more in this various sciences because there is a lot more co-authoring of papers. Um, One thing that's definitely a best practice and is taken I didn't know this kind of early on in my career, but now we do this very frequently, is to have explicit guidelines in the lab about kind of what constitutes authorship and how authorship order is decided. And I would strongly encourage you to do that before anybody has started working on the paper, because once people start working, they get invested and they make assumptions, and then people can get really upset. So, kind of having guidelines in your interactions with students that you can discuss ahead of time is really helpful. I think that we also have to be realistic that how generous you can be about single author papers and sort of doing things for students as a faculty member depends on where you are in your career. And so, for example, in the sciences with assistant professors, right? Like, it is a synergistic relationship, and the student needs for the faculty member to do well in order to promote their career, and the faculty member needs for the student to do well. But it's much more challenging, I think, for like assistant professors in the sciences to say, I'm going to devote a lot of time and money and lab stuff to you, and you go write your own sole author paper on that, right? Like, it's just harder. And as the student, you want that person to like get tenure and do well because you need them to write letters for you and all those sorts of things. So it's kind of synergistic. But you should be able to be, if you have clear guidelines, it can be clear when the student is going to be the first author, when you'll be the senior author, what constitutes second or third authorship in order. I do hope that people are able to become more generous over time as they are more settled in their career and it's less important for them. I try now to always say to my students, like, I'm happy to read and give feedback on any project, even if I'm not involved in it, right? Like, I don't need to be a co-author on a paper to read it and give you feedback. I encourage them to collaborate with other people. We set up, like during COVID, we've encouraged them to like generate their own working group so they start to work together so they can have interactions that are not just through me, those kinds of things. But I also recognize that it's easier for me as a full tenured professor to do some of that than it would have been when I was an assistant professor. So you do have to kind of give yourself some grace there. But again, I think if you have an explicit conversation with the student, the worst is when someone did a bunch of analyses, someone started writing the paper, and they both think they should be first author, and they've both invested a lot of time in it. It's really hard to walk back the feelings associated with that in a way that would have been very different if there had been an explicit conversation ahead of time about who was going to do what and who was going to be what author.
Great, thank you. Next question is, what's the best way to recover from a mistake as a mentor?
I think it's just to admit it. I think it's to say, you know what? I think this is where the parent analogy comes in. I think you just say, you know what? I messed up on that one. And I apologize to you. And this is why I did this, but I think I should have done this. And I'm sincerely apologize to you. And then figure out if there's a way to repair that, that wound or that injury. I think that's the best way. I don't think there's any point in trying to cover it up or trying to pretend like it didn't happen. I think that's the worst thing to do, because then it kind of sets up a kind of, you're modeling a lack of accountability, and you want to model accountability. And I think so the best way is to just hold yourself accountable and actually just admit it and apologize.
Yep. I don't have anything more to add. That's exactly what I would say.
Great. Next question is, how do you renew yourself so that you're being the best mentor you can be? And how do you take yourself out of the equation so that you're doing the best for your mentee and not just yourself?
God, these are not easy questions.
I know, I know. You know, I have to be honest, today helped with renewing myself. The sun was so nice today. And so I went outside and had lunch outside. I know that sounds really simple, but in this pandemic, that's not simple. That's actually really, I mean, it meant a lot to me today. So I try to be mindful of my own mood, my own health. That's how I renew myself. So I try to work out. I try to eat right. I just try to be mindful of myself. And I know this sounds really boring, and I try to monitor my sleep. Like I try to make sure I get proper amounts of sleep. All that to me goes into renewing myself. And I actually get a sense of joy seeing my mentees accomplish things and things that they set out to accomplish. I'm always like, I just really enjoy that when they're like, I did it, or you see the light bulb go off. I finally get it. I find that to be so just, I just enjoy that. So I think that that's one way. I always try to put the students' goals and their own stated aims first. And I think that's one way I keep myself out of it as much as possible.
Yeah, so those are all great suggestions. I think the analogy to parenting comes back again here in the sense of, I have two kids, so I'm a parent, and I know I have tried to pay attention. I'm not always great at this, but learning your triggers about when you're not going to be able to be your best mentor or parent, right? Like, when are you stressed? When are the rough times of year for you? What are the things that trigger your own ego and self-esteem, right? And trying to generate some insight into it so you recognize when you are going to have less to give and need to take some time versus more to give, and to share that with students, right? Like, we're all people. It's not like, if they think you're perfect and never upset about anything and never stressed about anything, it actually doesn't help to model that, because then they think it's not okay that they feel that way. So if you can model sort of productive ways of handling that stress, but admitting that you have stress and that you need things, um, so I think that's one way. I will admit sabbatical is really helpful in this regard too. As someone who's waiting for their next sabbatical, it's a time to have a little bit. You shouldn't abandon your mentees on sabbatical, but it is a little bit more time to kind of step back. I actually find that my mentees like constantly renew me in the sense that they have so many creative, interesting ideas that helps keep everything fresh, right? So um, I find them to be a source of kind of rejuvenation. But I would say try to like spend some actual time like introspecting about what are the trigger points for you, are things going to be hard, and you know letting them know, right? For us, it's grant time is hard, right? So sometimes you have less space and availability for students when you need a grant, but being explicit about it and honest and like working around it, I think is a lot better than just being grumpy and not saying something to people, right? Like, and I just would put a lot out there to modeling appropriate self-care and balance, those things, because otherwise they think it's not okay to do that, and that doesn't set them up for success in their career.
Great, thank you. Let's see, the next question is, what is the next step regarding addressing favoritism if the student has already attempted to handle it gracefully?
Next step was Aaron. Is we talking about the next step after the comment that Deanna and I made about how to handle that, framing it in terms of not going in hot, framing it in terms of focusing on the goal? Is that the question? So what to do after that?
I think the question, from the way I'm reading this in the question and answer box, is that given all the things that you suggested, which was a positive, productive way of going about it. If they've already done that or something similar and they feel like they've exhausted that approach, I think they're asking what is the next step after that, if there indeed is one.
Have you seen this,
I
Dan?
mean, yeah, I haven't had it for, I mean, I spent a lot of years as director of graduate studies in our department, and I honestly have never had anybody come in and talk to me about favoritism, but just more like not great mentoring behaviors. And it's so hard. I mean, I admit it's really hard. Another possibility that that we have done a few times in our department is then to have a mediated conversation, right? Because sometimes it's like, you know, maybe you thought you were having the conversation, but sometimes not everybody's really on the same page about it. So depending on what like your director of graduate studies or your chair is like and what kind of relationship you have with them, if it's possible to have like a three-way conversation that was mediated by the DGS to kind of help open up communication and talk about things. You know, I will admit you can't solve every situation. And sometimes, you know, if it's really bad and you're in a position to be able to think about switching mentors, sometimes that's the only solution. I know that's not always easy, and it's easy for me to say that, but you know, that, and I'm seeing the next question coming up too, right? Like, you know, we can't always force people to be different as much as we might want to. Um, and unless it's unethical behavior, right? Even if I disagree with a mentor's approach, if it's not unethical, I can't make them be different, right? And so sometimes you can try your best, but occasionally you have to think about, do you get an additional mentor, or do you think about switching mentors, even though that's the last, you know, it's the last recourse.
Yeah, and the next question is something, I mean, it's very similar to what you just answered, and that was how to deal with a repeated lack of accountability and mentorship. But I think the same things apply for that question as well. Is there anything distinct for that question that you wanted to offer? Okay, great.
I will say,
go ahead.
can I just say one thing about that? So kudos, we have been really trying to struggle with this in our department, and it's been hard because we have even had a hard time getting all the faculty agree. Like, we were trying to come up with like mentor expectations and be much more formal about it. And it has been a process. We're making some progress. But it's really interesting to see how put 20 faculty in a room and try to get them to agree on a list of it's really interesting how different people's expectations are. So just harking back to this, I know this helped now, but in the long term, like, I think we have to start doing the hard work to change these things and change these conversations. And there has to be kind of constant pressure from the next generation up to, you know, push kind of old fuddy-duddy faculty like myself to like do something different, right? And make changes for, you know, the next kind of generation of scholars. But it is challenging. I don't want to pretend that it's not.
Great, thank you. Very hard questions. Great questions, guys. Okay, next one is, I have a PI who picks favorites and refuses to mentor students if they don't want to run R1 research labs. Piggybacking off of the favoritism question, how can I, as a senior grad student, advocate to my mentor that they should mentor younger students regardless of their career goals?
You got anything?
And so I'm guessing this is obviously a, yeah, see, this is tough. This is in some ways a structural problem, right? Yeah, this is tough. I mean, I think the same things apply. I mean, I think that, as you said, I mean, well, see, I don't know, because if you're talking about a lab, it may not be as easy to to move, right?
It's hard. Um, and I think it's really, I mean, the problem is like,
Mm.
really, mentors should come with warning labels, right? Like, in an ideal world, you'd have a list on every mentor from every graduate student that said, okay, here's their positive characteristics, here's not their negative characteristics, and there'd be fair warning, so that students would kind of know what they're getting themselves into, right? Because some characteristics like that, like, you know, some mentors are just never going to be willing to mentor people who aren't willing to go into an R1 lab because they don't see, selfishly, right, the value in it for themselves, right? Like if they're not going to go do that, how does that help me? How does that help my reputation in the field? As opposed to maybe getting sort of intrinsic joy out of folks just doing well in whatever career path they are, right?
Right, right.
And I will be honest
Yes.
with you that, if that's that kind of person, you're probably going to feel pretty frustrated trying to convince them differently. Um,
Mhm.
One of the things we've tried to do is develop kind of warning labels for students, that new students that come into labs with people who are not engaging in unethical behavior or behavior that we could sort of really call out as like, you can no longer have graduate students, but so that they have fair warning
Yeah,
before they get enmeshed
yeah,
in the lab, and it's hard to back out of
yeah.
it, right? um, because once you're a year or two in, the restart cost is much harder than if you just rotate and land in a different lab, once you know that they're never going to tolerate anything other than an R1 career path.
Okay, the next question is, why are students put in a position to have to advocate for themselves to such an extent across a bunch of departments and disciplines? We've heard about this in a set of questions when their lives, careers, and mental health is in the balance.
Well, I'll say two things about that. I think one, I think you're right in the sense that some of these issues are structural, right, which then cause a great deal of pressure, a great deal of stress upon students. So I do think that you're right to say that, and you're right to be concerned about that, about that we have some structural things we need to fix. But I would also say, even if everything were fixed structurally, there's still a way in which part of what I think there are power imbalances. I understand that, but part of also what this cultivates is working on and cultivating a sort of habit of advocating for yourself. And I think that Professor Barch has said that about when she had to have intervention with a mentor, and just cultivating in which one is advocating for oneself. I think that's very important, in a professional way, but I still think it's very important. So even if things, and I want to be clear, I'm not denying the kinds of power imbalances and the kinds of structural things we need to fix within the profession. However, it's still also good to make sure that one is able to learn and cultivate the habit and ethos of advocating for oneself. I think that's so important.
Yeah, I mean, to piggyback off of that, I do think, we need to be addressing the structural issues, right? Like there, you cannot expect students to have to advocate against structural issues that should be fixed from a sort of top down manner, right? Appropriate resources, appropriate expectations, like, you know trying to get, having departments have conversations about mentorship and not being afraid to do that, and to make that part of the criterion evaluation for tenure, all those things, right? They are starting to be conversations, right? And not even just conversations, like we now have official mentor expectations in our department, and it was not an easy path to get there, but it was a path that the faculty needed to navigate and not leave to the graduate students, right? Because they are not in the position to advocate for that. But but I also think at the same time we all have to recognize that There are some things that you will not be able to change, right? So I'll just give you an example. I'm going to go back to the mentor who didn't want to mentor anybody who isn't going into an R1 situation, right? Um, that is, I may not agree with it, but if they were clear about that when they accepted a student into their lab, right, and then the student changed their mind, you know when I was director of graduate studies, like like there's not much I can say. If the mentor was clear, and that's an issue because they're not always clear, right? The mentor was clear about that and the student changed their mind, right? Like that's going to happen in life, and then you need to deal with that. But I think that's very different than the structural issues or like really bad mentorship practices where we have to stop being worried about pissing off our colleagues, and we need to speak out about it and be willing to confront our colleagues and say, like, that's not an appropriate way to treat a graduate student, right? Like, those kinds of things. And like, no more passing on bullshit to the next generation, right? Like that has to stop, and we have to really take responsibility and say the buck stops here.
All right. Next question is, where is the line drawn between problematic but ethical behavior and unethical behavior? And can you give examples?
You guys are just not giving us any easy ones here.
I'm not sure. Let me read that. I'm not sure. Let's see.
I'll ask it again
Oh.
also. Where is the line drawn between problematic but ethical behavior and unethical behavior? And can you give examples?
Yeah, okay. So I've thought about this a lot. So there's
Okay.
lots of things that are clearly unethical, right? Like not giving students credit, not, giving them I mean, those are no brainer. I think the more challenging ones are, um, imagine that I will only agree to meet with you at 7 a.m.s on Fridays, right? Because that's the only time that works in my schedule. So, that's not a very flexible behavior. I find that kind of problematic. Or I say, I'm going to always take a month to give you feedback on any written product, right? Like, I, I don't love that timeline, right? But is it unethical? You know, I don't know that I could say it's. I don't know that I have an ethical principle that I could point to, right? So it's those kinds of things that are. This is exactly where, like in our conversations about appropriate mentor expectations, it was exactly in this timeliness of feedback, frequency of meeting, flexibility of meeting. You know, kind of. Those kinds of things where like there's a lot of disagreement. Maybe it's not unethical, but sometimes it's problematic. Like those are the really challenging things and it's hard to know where to draw the line, right? Like I think it's unethical to take a month to give a student feedback personally, but I can tell you a whole bunch of my colleagues would be horribly offended if I said that to them and think I'm a complete crazo for saying that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I really appreciate you way you framed that, Deanna. That's helpful for me. I agree with you. I think that there is some things that are clearly unethical, especially as it relates to we think about inappropriate contact. You think about using profanity or physical aggression, all those things. We know those things, but it is these other things, about when you give feedback, when you do things of this nature. I guess one way I would advise, in today's world, one way to try to keep track of all this so it's not a kind of my word against their word is to try to keep things in writing. So if it is like, if it's an issue of feedback, you might be able to say, I've asked this person to give me feedback, I have it all written and they refuse to do so. And, I think it's good to have that so that you might be able to pursue other avenues. That's not necessarily unethical behavior, but it could be problematic behavior. And if you're applying for a grant or applying for a fellowship and you need feedback and you're not getting it. So I would try to keep things in writing in a way, as a way to sort of hold everything above board, everything's accountable, just in case you need to pursue other options.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not always a bright line in the sand because
Mm-mm, mm-mm.
the things that are really obvious are easier to tackle, but it's these things that are, you know, they're just differences of opinions. I mean, I don't want to call that. I don't mean to downplay that, but I may have a strong feeling about it, but I am always kind of really shocked and reminded when I talk sometimes to colleagues that they have a very different opinion about what is completely acceptable, ethical, normal behavior, and really don't see that as a problem, right? And so it that's where the challenges lie, I think.
And maybe this is another opportunity for us to, to sort of reemphasize, having a conversation about expectations. Because if you are feeling that something is unethical, it's good to have a very frank, professional conversation about it with the other person first, and to see if that behavior can be changed and adjusted prior to then taking it elsewhere. So, there are moments where, like Deanna said, that these things aren't necessarily bright lines in the sand, but you can help to illuminate them through a very frank conversation.
And I just want to be respectful of everybody's time because we are coming up on the end of this workshop. We will end at 7:30. We have several questions in the Q&A box, and so I'm going to bounce around just a little bit because I think we've covered a lot of similar topics. So just switch gears a little bit. I'm a female graduate student in a very male-dominated area of research. How do I approach conversations with my mentor about unconscious bias and sexist behavior by the other male mentees, such as being talked over repeatedly during lab meetings or interrupting and co-opting my conversations with my mentor?
I'm having some affective reaction to that. um,
Yeah.
uh, um, I think again, this comes back to a little bit. It's going to depend on what your relationship with the mentor is and how much you think that they have any sort of recognition, not necessarily even of it in the lab, but just like that these are issues in general. Um, uh, if you feel like you have a good relationship with them and that they're kind of aware of this, like you can be much more direct in it. If not, you know, readings help. Like I get it. I don't know how easy this is to do in your lab, but like, if you could share an article, with your mentor and ask, can we discuss this in the next meeting that we have? And, I would like to raise some concerns about some behaviors I've seen in the lab, so that again, there's sort of something outside of yourself that you can be saying, like, here's this paper that discusses these things, because that's really hard. And then, if you had another senior female member in the lab, I would
Right.
argue that they should be helping to advocate for you and that you could try to engage them as an advocate. Um, but if you're the only female in that male dominated lab, you know, that those might be two approaches that you could take.
And I would only add to that, I had the benefit of having good relationships with my colleagues who would let me know, like, that's kind of sexist, Lerone, or maybe, your gender privilege is shaping the way you view this. So what I've tried to always do, at least in my experience, and I don't know if you have any males in your lab like this, is I've always, now that I've, on the other side of tenure, I try to now be mindful of that and always to be allies to, as best as I can, to my junior colleagues who are women, and try to advocate for them so they don't have to always be the ones to speak out and speak up about these sorts of things. So I don't know if it's possible, if you have any men in your lab who may be able to play that role for you, so that you're not always constantly having to be the one to point out the gender bias in the room. because I know that burden is very, very, very heavy, and it's not fair that you'd have to be the one, because all of us want to be in a world a world of equality, an environment where people are treated as equals, and it shouldn't only be on you as a woman to make those claims. So I don't know if you have that possibility, but that would, that's one other option as well, in addition to having a senior woman.
Thank you. And last question, actually, this was pre-submitted. Looking back, what is it you appreciate most about a past mentee-mentor relationship that was not apparent at the time?
Not apparent at the time.
So things that you've come to appreciate now that maybe you didn't in the moment, but having been a mentor yourself for many years now, what do you appreciate most about a past mentee-mentor relationship?
I would just say time. I think that I maybe took for granted that, of course, this person is going to meet with me and talk to me about my exams. But now I'm on the other side. I'm like, man, they took the time to meet with me to talk about my exams. That's probably the main thing, that they took time and put things on the calendar months in advance. Like, we're going to meet on this day and we're going to talk about this when you come to meet with me. I think that's something I just thought was normal and came to realize it's not. So I think I would say that.
I mean, it's a tough question. I would say, I think my graduate school mentor in particular, in retrospect, I recognize now how hard he worked to really try to be very ethical as a mentor and to really like put my needs at the forefront. And I think this was particularly hard for him because he was a junior faculty member. I mean, I was his first graduate student. So he was trying to get tenure himself, but I never felt like he prioritized his needs over mine. And, now on the other side of things, knowing how many pressures you can have from different positions, I know how intentional that had to be on his part, and that the fact that he was like really deliberately being careful about that. And so I really appreciate that. And I always laugh and tell him that I have my WWHD moment, which is whenever I'm struggling with a thorny mentorship issue, I say, what would Howard do? Because he, I always felt like he really epitomized this sort of like really trying to have like clear ethical guidelines and like, putting students' needs ahead. And it does require it requires a lot of mental energy and emotional energy to do that all the time and not let your own, mess get in the way. So I appreciate that. Can I just say one thing to end at the end? I do think a lot of the issues raised here are structural issues that we still have work to do on in academia. And I will say that I would advocate that as much as possible, we have top-down pressure to do so, because it is much easier to get, I can tell you as a department chair in a DGS, it is much easier for me to get my faculty to move on things when I can say, the dean said we had to do this, right? Like the dean of the graduate school says, we're not getting graduate students if we don't get our act together, that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm only a little bit joking, right? Like, I do think that we need to like really make this a strong conversation, and that there needs to be accountability when, people are not behaving with the best interest of their mentees at heart. And that really needs to be coming from all levels, right? And not just be depending on mentees advocating for themselves upward.
That's right. Absolutely. And I can only say that I know some of the work that Deanna is doing, and I can say that that's absolutely true about the push coming from the top. And I hope that our graduate students will be able to see the results of that soon. And I see that your dog has made an appearance.
She's looking at me like, why are you not petting me?
Well, I just want to thank both of you. This was such an honest conversation, and I think it was really helpful for everybody. This has been recorded and will be available later, so people can further process and perhaps rewatch it later. Again, just thank you both for your time, your wisdom, and your honest answers. And everybody who attended, thank you. And what great questions. These were hard questions to both ask and answer. And I think it's the beginning of a conversation. So
Yes.
thank all of you.
Thank
and
you.
take care.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to serve with, to be
Yeah,
asked.
thank you.
And Deanna, it was a pleasure to be on this panel with you.
And I with you, I learned quite a bit myself. So
Are we
right.
able to maybe respond to some of these anonymous questions? I mean, I saw that one of them was
Sure.
really,
If you
really
don't
pressing.
have to hop off right now, we do have a couple of more questions. Just wanted to be respectful of your time. If you have 5 minutes or so, do you want to?
Well, I was just wondering if you want us to type to them. Some of those questions, especially along the topic of sexism, should be addressed.
Okay. Sure. What we can, because we have a recording of all of these questions. So what we can do is offline, maybe type up some answers.
Okay.
I don't know, and put them in a Q&A, because we already have a page for our faculty workshop series with the content that was presented.
Okay.
So we can present it as Q&A on that page so people can refer to that information later.
Okay. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Deanna.
Very welcome. Thank
Yeah,
you so
thank
much.
you. Thank you,
Have a
everybody.
great night.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.